समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Let's talk about the flavor of the season, the recently concluded Free Trade Agreement or the FTA between India and the European Union, which is unprecedented. Few bilateral arrangements in modern trade diplomacy can match the scale or ambition of what the mother of all deals has unlocked. The numbers alone justify the excitement. The agreement is expected to double EU exports to India by 2032, with tariffs removed or reduced on about 96.6% of EU goods entering the Indian market. In return, the EU will liberalize tariffs on 99.5%, which is almost all, of Indian goods over a 7-year period. Once ratified by the European Parliament, formal signing is expected later this year, with entry into force projected around early 2027. The next test, however, will lie in the boost to Indian manufacturing and infrastructure modernization should the bilateral investment treaty follow and investments come to India. And now let me come to the main topic of this column. As the initial euphoria settles and the hard legal work of translating political intent into binding text begins, some wider consequences of this India-EU FTA should be discussed. In particular, there is a cousin arrangement born not out of the mother of all deals itself, but out of the EU's existing trade architecture. So New Delhi must now understand and engage with the EU's customs union with Turkey and its implications. So why do we need to understand the customs union and its relations with Turkey? In recent years, Turkey has largely featured in Indian strategic discourse for all the wrong reasons. Erdogan's support for Pakistan on the internationalization of Kashmir, Turkey's growing defense industrial synergies with Pakistan and Bangladesh, and its role in fueling hostile narratives against India, especially after Operation Sindoor. All of these have cast Ankara in an almost uniformly negative light of discomfort, distrust, and strategic concern in New Delhi. The signing of the India-EU agreement, however, provides India with a different opportunity to revisit the Turkey question, and this time with greater nuance and, for a change, from an economic and trade perspective. This issue featured in expert discussions held recently in New Delhi during a conference I participated in, which was on India-EU relations in a multipolar world, co-organized by CSTR and St. Anthony's College from the University of Oxford. Coinciding with the EU-India summit, experts there discussed how India would address the EU's existing customs union with Turkey. Does the India-EU FTA create unintended exposure for Indian markets or vice versa? Are there risks of trade diversion or hidden benefits for non-EU partners? And that brings us to the question, are there opportunities that India could leverage in this particular regard, or are there challenges that we need to be careful about? Naturally, to answer these, one must first understand what a customs union is and why Turkey is uniquely asymmetric in its relationship with the West. Established in 1968, the EU Customs Union is a foundational pillar of European economic integration. It eliminates custom duties among members, establishes a common external tariff for goods entering the Union, and enables seamless internal trade. It also serves broader goals such as protecting consumers, facilitating innovation, and strengthening the EU's position in global trade. Now, while primarily an EU construct, 3 non-EU countries have joined customs union with the bloc. And these 3 are Turkey, Andorra, and San Marino. These arrangements allow the free movement of specific categories of goods, different for each case, these 3 cases, without custom duties. The interesting bit is they do not, however, confer decision-making powers or broader market access comparable to EU membership or the benefits of the FTAs that EU signs. So it sounds more like half a union with complicated commitments, right? Turkey's customs union with the EU came into force on 1st January 1996 under decision number 1/95 of the European Commission Turkey Association Council. This decision was itself rooted in the 1963 Ankara Agreement. That arrangement required Turkey to adopt the EU's common external tariff and align its commercial policy with that of Brussels for goods that were covered under those formalities. Now, the customs union, an interesting point, the customs union was never meant to be a permanent objective in itself. It was conceived as a transitional step towards eventual EU membership. However, nearly 3 decades later, Turkey remains outside the EU, with accession talks effectively frozen since 2018 due to persistent concerns over democratic backsliding, the rule of law, and human rights abuses under the President Erdogan. So now you'll ask, why does Turkey remain into this customs union with the EU if the accession talks are already frozen? Now, the answer is that despite this political stalemate, Turkey's economic integration with Europe remains reasonably deep. The customs union has played a significant role in Turkey's industrial modernization and export growth, eventually making the EU Ankara's largest trading partner. At the same time, the arrangement continues to be structurally limited, if not flawed, because Turkey must align with EU trade policy without having a seat at the table. This creates imbalances and constraints, especially as the global trade landscape evolves. So, is India going to have an uncomfortable conversation, or are we going to avoid it totally? Now, under the newly concluded India-EU deal, Indian goods gain preferential access not only to EU markets, which means 27 member states, but also to markets of countries that have customs union agreements with the EU, including Turkey, as well as Andorra and San Marino. However, the reverse does not apply. Turkish goods do not gain any preferential access to India simply because Turkey is part of the EU customs union. Now, this asymmetry is fundamental. Turkey must align with the EU's external tariffs, but it cannot leverage EU FTAs with third countries such as India for its own exports unless India separately agrees, which means India has a separate arrangement with Turkey. Now, for now, this dynamic works in India's favor. However, talks on updating the EU-Turkey customs union were launched a few years ago and have continued very much into 2026, with Ankara pushing for an expanded scope that includes services, agriculture, and public procurement. Now, no breakthrough has yet occurred, but that is not the same as saying that it will never happen. Because remember that in the eventuality of a diminished or even adversarial US role in NATO, what we saw with regard to Greenland, Turkey has the largest land forces in the alliance and remains a staunch supporter for Ukraine with reasonable clout in Russia. It makes sense for Brussels to keep Turkey actively engaged in the European system, even without full accession, which of course seems impossible under Erdogan. So, coming to India now, India-Turkey trade has also grown steadily despite political tensions. In financial year 2025, bilateral trade reached approximately $10 billion, and this was heavily skewed in India's favor. Indian exports dominate that relationship, and this surplus is likely to widen as the India-EU FTA comes into force next year. Indian companies have already invested around 126 million in Turkey, while Turkish investment in India stands at about 200 million. So paradoxically, even though we don't get along with Turkey, the EU-India FTA creates an opening for India. In my opinion, it creates a newfound space for India to pursue pragmatic compartmentalization. It has been confirmed by Indian authorities that there is no immediate danger of Turkish goods flooding Indian markets through the back door of the EU. That fear is, I would agree, misplaced. But there is a strategic opportunity for India to use the India-EU FTA as a structured channel to recalibrate economic engagement with a difficult but consequential partner. The rationale here is not naive good boyism, nor is it an argument to underplay Turkey's growing defense industrial footprint in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and soon possibly Sri Lanka as well. Rather, the rationale for pragmatism is grounded in strategic realism. Trade engagement can act as a stabilizer, a way to balance hostile energies in volatile geopolitical times and prevent further strategic drift in India's neighborhood. And here I mean Pakistan and Bangladesh. So, if Turkey succeeds in updating its customs union with the EU to make it more comprehensive and economically viable, Indian exporters stand to benefit even more. What remains unclear is what benefits such an upgrade could bring to Ankara vis-à-vis India. Now, at a time when India already enjoys a surplus with Ankara, it would be beneficial to use it as a leverage, not as a vulnerability. And the final argument that I have today is perhaps the most compelling. India continues to pursue a complex, compartmentalized relationship with China despite the 113 billion trade deficit, a deep supply chain dependencies in critical sectors, and Beijing's active support for Pakistan, including during Operation Sindoor, in addition to all the challenges we have along the LAC, which is our border. Now, if New Delhi can adopt a pragmatic, interest-based approach with Beijing under far more adverse conditions, there is little reason not to do the same with a smaller but the agile force, which is Ankara. Allowing India's neighbors to drift further into Turkey's orbit would only reinforce President Erdogan's anti-India narrative. Engagement, by contrast, would create more options. In that sense, India-EU FTA, in its scope and scale, goes beyond being a mere trade agreement. I'll be back to discuss more developments on the uncomfortable conversation with the difficult cousin, thanks to the mother of all deals. Stay tuned.